Great. We're delighted to be joined by Pramila Patten, who is here to brief us on her trip to Iraq and the Republic of the Sudan. And after the SRSG is done, we'll hear from Brendan on behalf of the PGA. So, welcome et bienvenue.
It was on. Right, thank you. Thank you, and good afternoon to all. Thank you for attending this briefing, for your interest in covering this critical but too often silenced subject, conflict-related sexual violence. And I really count on you, the international media, to really help break the silence and to sustain, ensure that it sustains global public interest. I would start by expressing my sincere appreciation to both the government of Sudan and Iraq for inviting me recently. In the case of Sudan especially, this marks the first time that my office, my mandate has been invited to engage with the government. And therefore, it was a very important visit to the extent that it marks my wish that there will be a sustained and constructive dialogue to address issues of common concern. For Iraq, I was there to really continue the work started by my predecessor, who signed a joint communique with the government of Iraq in September 2016. My predecessor, Mrs. Bangura, visited Iraq twice before, and there has been technical missions of my office. The main purpose was to really engage with all the main stakeholders regarding an implementation plan which was in the making for the priorities outlined in the joint communique. I'll start with my visit in Sudan, which was from the 18th to the 25th of February, with engagements both in Khartoum and Darfur. In Khartoum, I met with ministers of defense, interior, health, social affairs, and foreign affairs, as well as parliamentarians, civil society representatives, National Human Rights Commission, and the Bar Association. I also had the opportunity to meet with representatives of non-governmental organizations, including women's rights organizations. In Darfur, I visited North Darfur, El Fasher, and West Darfur, El Janina, where I met with the respective state governors, Wali as they are called, and the state security committees. I visited women in two camps, Abu Shok in El Fasher and Al Hujaj camp in El Janina, women who had been displaced as a result of the conflict. In El Fasher, I also met with the Prosecutor General of the Special Court for Darfur, which has jurisdiction over conflict-related crimes committed in Darfur since February 2003. There appears to be an overall improvement in the security situation in Darfur, as in fact noted in Security Council Resolution 2363, adopted in June of last year, and as reiterated in the report of the panel of experts of the Security Council Sanctions Committee for Sudan, which came out in December of last year. However, as also emphasized in the Security Council resolution, I found the situation to remain precarious, especially for women and girls, whose vulnerability remains very high. There remain serious concerns regarding conflict-related sexual violence in Darfur. During my brief visit to both camps, I learned that the women and girls are especially at risk of sexual violence when they step out of the camps, especially to pursue their livelihood activities. In El Janina, I heard from women who are unable to return to their pre-war homes due to security concerns and fear of being raped. In addition, some women told me about sexual violence committed in the context of intercommunal conflicts over land and natural resources. And in this regard, I must say that the initiative of the government to collect illegal arms and the ammunition is quite positive and is a critical measure in the right direction to improve the security of women and girls. I had extensive discussion with national authorities about the importance of strengthening accountability for sexual violence as a critical aspect of deterrence and prevention, and stressing that the state bears the primary responsibility to hold perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence accountable, and that this requires a criminal justice system which includes institutions willing and able to conduct investigations and prosecutions in accordance with international standards, the adoption and implementation of comprehensive legislation that guarantees equal protection of the law, that prohibits all forms of sexual violence and ensures the protection and well-being of victims and witnesses, public awareness initiatives to educate the population about their rights, and the allocation of adequate resources to criminal justice institutions and service providers. And in this regard, I must say that there are some encouraging amendments brought recently to the criminal code, such as on the definition of rape, as well as on the establishment of women and child protection police units. All these are positive steps forward. At the same time, I note that there are no female judges in any of the 5 states of Darfur, and I expressed the need for female judges as well as more female police investigators and prosecutors. The issue of existing immunity for state security forces from prosecution is a major challenge in ensuring accountability. But I was encouraged by the draft law that is before Parliament to lift such immunity. Sexual violence is difficult issue to address, particularly and very sensitive in the context of Sudan. And one of my key observations to the different interlocutors was the existence of a deep-seated culture of denial of sexual violence, which enhances and feeds the culture of silence about the crime. And although I stress that Sudan is not unique in this respect, I stress the challenge that they have in breaking the silence in order to overcome this issue. As an outcome of my visit, it's my hope that the government of Sudan will agree to adopt a framework for cooperation with the United Nations, and such a framework will reflect the government's commitment to address conflict-related sexual violence and provide a basis for United Nations support to the national authorities. I have proposed that the framework of cooperation focuses on 5 priority areas, namely survivors' access to medical, psychosocial, legal, and socioeconomic services, monitoring, analysis, documentation, and information sharing on sexual violence, rule of law response to conflict-related sexual violence, including law reform, engagement with the security sector in the form of training, and engagement with religious leaders and civil society. I have also proposed to deploy a United Nations technical team to Sudan to undertake a needs assessment and from there to develop a plan to implement the framework. With regard to Iraq, I visited Iraq from the 26th of February to the 5th of March, and my visit marks the validation of the Joint Communiqué's implementation plan. The development of that implementation plan is a clear demonstration of the continuous commitment of the government to address the plight of the victims of conflict-related sexual violence. In my 8-day visit, I met with Prime Minister Al-Abadi and with other senior government officials at federal, regional, and provincial levels in Baghdad, Erbil, and Mosul. In Mosul, where thousands of Iraqi women and girls were subjected to rape, sexual slavery, and other grave forms of sexual violence perpetrated by Daesh, I was also joined by Lord Ahmad of Wimbledon, Minister of State at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the United Kingdom's Prime Minister's Special Representative on Preventing Violence, Sexual Violence in Conflict. Lord Ahmad joined me in the call to the authorities of Nineveh Governorate and Provincial Council to address the pressing needs of survivors in ongoing reconstruction efforts, including the significant need for scaling up of medical services, mental health and psychosocial support, and economic livelihood opportunities for women. I have also engaged directly with survivors of sexual violence. I met with civil society groups, and I also met with Christian, Shia, Sunni, Turkmen Shia, and Yazidi religious leaders. I heard firsthand the heart-wrenching accounts of survivors of Daesh sexual violence. Many of the women who remain displaced express serious safety concerns regarding their return to their homes due to activity from different militia groups and the reported presence of former Daesh combatants within their community. Sunni women in particular shared their fear of reprisals on account of the wrong perception of affiliation with Daesh. The situation of survivors returning with children is extremely disturbing. While some religious leaders may show some empathy, the tribal leaders display a profound reluctance to accept children born of rape. And I was informed by the provincial authorities of Mosul of the setup of different orphanage with thousands of children. Religious leaders, but also survivors, as well as civil society organizations, expressed concern about the missing persons, including women and girls still under Daesh captivity. And there is a perception that the government is not doing enough. And I raised this issue with all the government officials at federal and regional level. During discussion with Iraqi officials on the question of justice and accountability, while acknowledging the efforts of the government, I stressed the importance of ensuring that alleged Daesh perpetrators are held accountable not only for the crime of terrorism, but for the full extent of the sexual violence crimes perpetrated on Iraqi women and children, including abduction, rape, sexual slavery, and forced marriages, and expressed concern that up to now, there has been no single prosecution under the criminal code for sexual violence crimes, and that all prosecutions have been under the anti-terrorism law, and express interest to work directly with Iraqi judges, investigators, and prosecutors, together with the new investigative team that will be established under Resolution 2379. So these were the key messages to the government, namely the need to pursue efforts to rescue those missing, to ensure justice and reparation to all victims of the heinous crimes of sexual violence, and also to include women in this critical peace-building, reconciliation, and reconstruction phase. I also urged the government to ensure that women and girls who were victims of Daesh are not wrongfully perceived as being affiliates, associates, or intelligence asset, and urge the government to ensure that all survivors of conflict-related sexual violence are fully protected and that perpetrators of these crimes are brought to justice. I think I'll stop here and will be very happy to respond to any questions that you may have.
Edie?
Thank you very much, Ms. Patten. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, welcome and thank you for this briefing. I have two questions. First, are there any figures either in Darfur or in Iraq on the number of women and girls who have been subjected to sexual abuse, how widespread it is? And in terms of the women and girls in Mosul and other areas that were under control of Daesh. What kind of treatment are they getting now? Are there any psychologists, psychosocial support, medical people helping them? What kind of shape are they in? Thank you.
Well, I do not have with me the figures for actual figures for either Darfur or Iraq. Clearly, the Darfur context is very different. The visit is quite different because I only visited two IDP camps, and the women. It was quite difficult to engage with the women and to really assess the quality and quantity of service provision, knowing the history of denial of humanitarian actors. But with regard to Iraq, there is in spite of all the efforts of all the humanitarian actors, I find a gross lack of both physical and mental health, psychosocial support, but especially in the quality of the psychosocial support that is required by survivors of sexual violence, in the sense that there is a need for very specialized service, which I think is not there, simply not there. The survivors that I met, I'm sorry to say that they were like living corpses sitting in front of me. And none of them, they were very recently released early this year, and none of them had received any kind of physical or psychosocial support. But that, I must say, was also due to the fact that they explained to me that they were confined in their camp out of fear of being because of the stigma and the double stigma of being victims of sexual violence and sexual slavery, but also the second layer of the stigma of being associated with Daesh. And some also express a fear of being detained. So they are very much confined, including by their parents. They're not stepping out of their camp and have not had an opportunity to avail themselves of the limited, even psychosocial support that there is inside the camp. Because the survivors that I met came from two different camps where I know about the large number of social workers working there and the services provided by different agencies, but they simply did not avail themselves out of stigma and fear due to that perception of being affiliate of Daesh.
Is the government aware of this? Are the humanitarian organizations aware of it, and what are they doing?
I had a debriefing with the UN country team and shared that with them, but I also shared this concern with the government.
What are the prospects for these girls and women, particularly the ones who were victims of sexual slavery by Daesh? What kind of a future is there for them? Are they? You said they were concerned. I mean, is there a chance that they could be reintegrated into society?
I met with religious leaders, with all the religious leaders. They show a lot of empathy towards the women returning, although that's not quite the case for the Turkmen Shia. And in fact, the Turkmen Shia religious leader cannot account for the women who were under Daesh captivity, and they believe that those women, due to the stigma and due to the known fact that they will be rejected by their communities, may have integrated other societies. So the Turkmen Shia cannot even account for the women and girls who have been under Daesh captivity. The Yazidi, many of them have left the country, and many are looking forward to leave the country. country. They do not see a lot of hope in staying in Iraq. And in fact, the religious leaders and also the women that I met expressed the wish to leave the country. They do not see any hope. And they go back to the history of persecution that they have been subjected to. So the picture is not is quite a gloomy one.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much for the briefing. James Reinl, Middle East Eye. A couple of questions for Pramila, but first of all, a quick aside to Stefan. You mentioned that Martin Griffiths is going to be at UNHQ next week. If, by any small chance, you could get him in for a briefing with us, that would be really good for us. Pramila, thanks so much, and it's great to hear about your visit over to Iraq. A couple of questions. Edie asked about numbers. I'm interested in how many women are not accounted for right now, went missing. I believe there was a number floating around of 6,000 or 7,000 Yazidis who were enslaved. Apparently, November 27, there were 3,000 of them remaining in captivity, but we don't really have anything all that recent on that, so anything you got on that would be good. Also, in your opening remarks, you mentioned something that sounded a little bit like an orphanage for ISIS rape babies. That startled me a little bit, and it just sounds like something that we need to know a lot more about, if you can help us there.
Right. In terms of numbers, this is what I got from the Office of Genocide and also from the religious leaders. Missing the Yazidi community, it's a total of 3,154, of whom 1,471 women and girls. For the Turkmen Shia, 1,200 are missing, of whom 600 are women and 250 are children. So these are the figures that I have concerning the missing. With regard to the orphanage, you are right that this is something on which we need more information, and I will be sending a technical mission very soon in April to follow up on my meeting. But this is the information that I got from the governor of Nineveh when I raised the question of children born of rape, and also from the provincial authorities, provincial council. They said that they had to open a number of orphanages because many children are being abandoned. I mean, all these children born of rape are being abandoned, and from all religious faith, Turkmen, Shia, Yazidi, and no one is going back with the children. And in fact, this is I think I don't know whether I mentioned this. Although the Yazidi religious leader Baba Sheikh a couple of years ago, I think 2016, was and my predecessor even had a meeting with him, and he was like really embracing the women who were being released, but they also have been silent on accepting the children born of rape, and I raised it with the religious Yazidi leaders, and they explained that it's unacceptable in their community because Yazidi women cannot have a child outside the Yazidi community, and for that reason the children simply will not be accepted.
Matthew?
Any idea of numbers? And does that sound like that might be a problem for the future?
The children, no, I don't have, and that's an area where I would want, because I want to focus on the issue of the children born of rape and their registration, their civil status, and I had a very good discussion with Prime Minister El Abadi on this and the legal limbo. Although, according to their constitution, nothing prevents a mother from transmitting her citizenship, and they have also ratified the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women and do not have a reservation to Article 9 on nationality, but they are putting their culture and religion to say that a woman cannot transmit her name to a child if the father is unknown. So since I want to focus on these children, I also need to know the numbers, and the orphanage will be one way of ascertaining how many children are in those orphanages.
Sure. Matthew Lee, Inner City Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks a lot for the briefing. I wanted to ask you, it seems that during your visit in Sudan, the special prosecutor for Darfur crimes, Ali Fatih Mohammed Tayfour, complained to you that UNAMID is hiding those accused within the UNAMID mission of sexual abuse of Sudanese citizens. At least that's what he said, that he raised to you. And I wanted to know, and they're pointing to this case that was said in November that they were going to investigate a civilian staff member. Was this raised to you, and what was your response to it? And my second question is one that I was trying to ask when the first briefing ended, but I think it's an appropriate one to you. In terms of your role, you've been talking about procedure and fairness to victims in these cases. In the recent exoneration of Luis Loures by UNAIDS, I'm asking you because there's quotes in an article by Lauren Wolfe by Mr. Swanson of OIOS saying that currently for sexual harassment or abuse in the UN, they're applying a clear and convincing evidence standard, which is a very high standard, and it's not clear who can meet the standard, and that's one of the reasons that Mr. Loures was first exonerated and then ended up resigning. I wanted to know, what do you think of the current standard of proof and procedures within the UN system to prove, at least for purposes of disciplinary action, if not, I guess, criminal action, the existence of sexual abuse or harassment? Thank you.
Yeah, with regard to my meeting with the special prosecutor, he indeed raised it, and subsequent, because I did not have that information, and I raised it with the SRSG of UNAMID, who confirmed that there were 2 cases that were fully investigated, which concerned 2 Ghanaians, and that there were no that the 2 Ghanaians were handed over to the government of Sudan for the purpose of the inquiry, and that none of the 2 allegations were found to be substantiated in any manner whatsoever. So he gave an explanation and also gave a press conference on with regard to these 2 cases while I was actually there in Darfur, or was on my way out, back to Khartoum. With regard to your question about the standard of proof, I will be very honest that I have not looked at the standard of proof, and will be very happy to look into it. As a practicing lawyer, I will be very, and a former criminal lawyer, I will be very interested to look into it and have a further discussion with you, and we'll be happy that you raise this question again in the next briefing.
Great. Thanks a lot. Just one quick follow-up. I want to make sure I understood. When you said that they were, I don't know if you said turned over, but maybe I wasn't listening right. Did these Ghanaian staff members or military personnel of UNAMID, they were subject to a Sudanese government investigation? I'm asking because the government of South Sudan has asked that the Ghanaians in WOW be subject to some either joint or government, and the mission there has said no, only the UN can investigate itself. I just want to understand what happened in this case.
My understanding was that they were turned over to the government of Sudan for their investigation.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just a little confused about the Sudan visit. You said you were invited by the government. Obviously, they knew you were coming to investigate or look at cases of sexual violence against women. So then they invited you knowing that you were coming, and then they were going to deny that there's sexual violence in the country. It's just a little confusing, the sequence of events. And then how often are these women in camps being raped, women and girls? I mean, is there some sort of level of daily occurrences, and who's doing the violence? Thanks.
Right. The Sudan visit was the very first time that my office was allowed to visit. My predecessor had tried to visit Sudan in the past, but the government was not willing to engage. So since I took office last June, I tried to reach out to the permanent mission and discuss the possibility of engagement and the invitation. I did not go for the purpose of conducting an investigation. It was a very first visit to engage with the government and to hear from them, to get their perspective and to see as much as possible. I must say that the visit to the camps were very useful, and the meeting with NGOs was also very useful, because as I said, there was the invitation was there. I met with the government officials, but they seem to be saying that the security situation has improved considerably, and it's not happening. And it was their narrative was that it's not happening anymore. Also putting across their religion, culture, and tradition to explain that it's not happening. Whereas my visit in the camps. And they were very proud about their initiative about collection of arms and security in all the Darfur states. Whereas my meeting with the women, in spite of the constraint in those meetings, open settings, not very conducive for women to speak out, but the message was very clear. It was of a general nature, but it was very clear that there was serious security concern outside the camp. They felt safe. These are people who have been in the camp since 2004, and we are in 2018. And they were saying they are simply do not feel safe outside the camp, and this was really impacting on their economic livelihood. And if you see the report of the panel of experts, there is apparently a peak in the number of sexual violence cases during farming season when they go out and harvest their land. So that's my response.
Thank you. Farnaz, and then I think that'll be the last question.
Thank you for the briefing. I wanted to go back to the women of ISIS. The ones who were forced into marriage, have the clerics or the Iraqi system nulled their marriage? Are they considered divorced now? What's the status on that? And back to the orphanages, do they exist now in Nirvan? Or are they going to open them? And these children, were they abandoned as the women fled Mosul? So they found babies and children abandoned? Or were they bringing them out and then giving them up? What were the circumstances of that, if you...
Right. I don't have the details of how the children ended up in the orphanage, but I have confirmation that there are many orphanages that have been opened precisely to welcome children born of rape of ISIS. With regard to marriage, you have raised an interesting question. I met with civil society organizations that brought this up, but I also met with women in one camp who were basically Sunni women, who were saying that there has been a lot of focus on the plight of the Yazidi and the other religious minorities, and that their plight were not very much taken into account. And they shared with me what happened, how they were given away, sometimes by force, by their families, given away and having to marry. And today that they have returned, that many Sunni women are detained on account of their forced marriage to Daesh perpetrators. They are Daesh wives. They have children with no legal status. Or sometimes these children have ISIS-issued documents which are not recognized. But there's also that fear of being detained. So I think the situation of the Sunni women is quite disturbing.
The same way in Afghanistan after the Taliban, after the fall of the Taliban, where there were all these women who were forced to marry Taliban or Al-Qaeda, and they were left behind with children and questionable marital status. And I don't know what has become of that 20 years on, and whether you've looked into that or as a way to resolve the Daesh women issue.
In Iraq, there is a tendency to say that these women have to be remarried. Some religious leaders were saying there is a need, these women are now widows with children, and the way out is to marry them off, and that incentives need to be given to men to marry them. And they even suggested that it should be land or apartments given to the men to marry these women. They have no identity without marriage, without men.
Ms. Patten, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Brendan is now up. Thank you.